Good afternoon, Mr. Garst.
Good afternoon.
Pleasure. Thank you for coming down here to speak with me, interview about your experiences for the Veteran History Project. Let's start off with your youth. You grew up in Roanoke. Could you touch a little bit on your childhood, parents, siblings, this sort?
Yeah, I grew up in Roanoke. I had no siblings. My dad was a World War II veteran. He served in the Pacific in the Navy. So I kind of grew up with a little bit of a, not military background, but just knowing that, my dad had been in World War II. I was very active in Boy Scouts growing up. I was an Eagle Scout, and that kind of gave me a certain amount of experience, exposure to organization, some discipline, that kind of thing. So I came to Virginia Tech in fall of 1962 as a freshman in Corps Cadets. My major was forestry, and so I spent 4 years in the Corps Cadets and graduated in June of 1966 with a degree and a commission in the Army. So,
what was your motivation for pursuing the Army and then going the ROTC route to begin with?
Well, I guess I kind of grew up, like I said, with my dad being in the military, and I had cousins and all that were military. So it's sort of like I'm supposed to go in the military when you get to be a certain age. So it's like, you got several different routes. But then I found out about the ROTC program, and I was able to go to college. So it's like, well, put the two together and fulfill your military obligation at the same time getting your degree. And Virginia Tech was nearby, and they offered a program in forestry, which a lot of colleges didn't. And I don't know, the ROTC thing was just somewhat attractive. And like I said, the Boy Scouts had kind of given me some of that discipline and organizational kind of thing that made my transition into the Corps, I won't say easy, but probably a lot easier than a lot of other kids may have experienced.
What was your parents' reaction to this decision that you wanted to join the Army? Was it negative, positive, supportive?
Well, my dad always wanted me to go in the Air Force. So I started out in Air Force ROTC when I came to Virginia Tech, my first 2 years. And then after my first 2 years, I transferred to Army. Well, my dad had passed away in my sophomore year. So he never knew it, but probably he would have been opposed to it. But I just, I felt like since I couldn't fly, that maybe the Air Force wasn't, well, I was afraid I'd end up as a supply officer in the Air Force, and I didn't want to do that. So as it happened, I ended up as a supply officer in the Army. But I guess my mother was not really too keen on me going in the military at all. But again, she kind of expected. I mean, that's what you did, in that time.
And was ROTC scholarship based at that point?
No.
It was all. And what was the commitment upon graduation?
When you graduated, if you had a reserve commission, it was a 2-year commitment, and if you took a regular Army commission, it was a 3-year commitment.
Okay.
And no, we didn't have an ROTC scholarship, but we did get your junior and senior year. You got $50 a month as a stipend, and that was a lot of money. That took a really, that was spending money and books money, and back in those days, that was good money.
Could you talk a little bit about your experience in the Corps here, about day to day, and maybe like a best moment, worst moment, that kind of thing, of your experience your 4 years here?
Yeah, it was a lot different than it is today. It came in as a freshman, and officially there was no hazing. But there really was, you were at the bottom rung as a freshman, and you were harassed. There was no physical harassment, but just mental and all. I mean, and there was actually, I think, an effort to if you couldn't cut it, we want to get rid of you. That sort of thing your freshman year. So the freshman year was rough. In addition, you had, of course, your studies, which was kind of a big chunk for a lot of kids coming in. But the Corps was 24 hours a day. You got up in the morning, prepared your room for inspection, went to formation at 7 a.m. or 6:45 or whatever in uniform. You marched to breakfast. After breakfast, you came back, and before you left for class, your room had to be ready for inspection. You wore your uniform to class. You came back, and then at 5 o'clock or 1,700 hours, you had another formation for flags, and then you would march to the dining hall for dinner. And then after that, you were pretty much free in your room to study or whatever, but you were still under the watchful eye of upperclassmen the whole time. So the freshman year was rough. We lost probably 50% of my class by the end of the freshman year. And once you turned and became a sophomore, it got easier and better, you know. And but by that time, you had formulated a close friendship with all your rat buddies, you know. And I stay in contact with some of those guys still today. And so it built a cohesive group of guys. And then as you moved on up, then it's unlike it is today, where you change companies or you change assignments through the year. You stayed in the same unit all 4 years, and you progressed. You know, as a sophomore, you could become a PFC, and as a junior, you became a corporal, and in your senior year, you either became an NCO or a cadet officer. And I was a cadet first lieutenant. I was executive officer of my company.
Okay. And that was, back then you lived with your ROTC. You're only with Air Force kids or only with Army kids?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes. Now, I was a little different because I changed. But everybody in my company basically was Air Force except me. I got an exemption just to stay with that unit. But everybody you lived with that same group of guys all 4 years. And of course, the seniors would graduate and you'd get a new bunch of freshmen in. But it was the same group really for 4 years.
And it was just Air Force and Army?
Yes. No Navy at the time. Okay. Correct.
Do you know a number of people in the Corps at that time? I know it was kind of small. It wasn't a lot smaller during
it started out, my freshman year, we had about 2,300 in the Corps because it was mandatory at that time. Well, after my sophomore year, that's when they changed the rule and they said it's no longer mandatory. Well, of course, that, you know, the participation from freshmen coming in just nosedived. I think somewhere at the end of my senior year, it was somewhere around 1,200, something like that. So, I mean, it was cut in half over 4 years. And the university was growing at the same time, so the overall percentage of cadets within the student body went down significantly. So it was, you know, we saw a big drop after 1964, yeah.
Okay. And then how did you land on forestry as a major?
I didn't know what else I wanted to do. Either I want to major in history or forestry. And I figured, well, if I major in history, I'll end up being a history teacher in high school, and I really didn't want to do that. But forestry, again, I'd been exposed to that through the Boy Scouts, and I had an uncle that was worked for the Virginia Department of Forestry. So it was just something I was interested in, you know, and I'd always done okay in biology. And so it was something that I was kind of interested in. I didn't want to be an engineer. So it worked. You know, I may be one of the few guys that ever came through and started off in one major and ended up 4 years later in that same major, because a lot of guys change their direction as they go through. But so.
And could you explain a little bit about we talked briefly on the phone, but about the branching assignments and how that went for you and how that process works?
Yeah. Somewhere, and I don't remember whether it was your senior year, maybe towards the end of the junior year, you got to put in a preference sheet as to what branches you want. And my first preference was Corps of Engineers, because that's where most of the forestry graduates went. And this was for reserve commission. So Corps of Engineers, that was kind of what I assumed I would get. Well, then I was selected for a regular Army commission, and that starts the process all over. So you had to pick one combat arm as your preference, and then the other two, second and third choice, could be anything. Well, I picked Corps of Engineers again as my choice. I guess you had to have one of the three had to be a combat arms. So I picked Corps of Engineers again. My combat arms choice was armor, and then I think my third choice was, I don't know, Transportation Corps, or I'm not sure what it was. And then when the assignments came out, I was slated to commission Quartermaster Corps with a detail armor. If you got a regular Army commission as a non-combat arms officer, you had to serve 2 years in a combat arms before you transferred to that. So that's what I say. I ended up not wanting to be an Air Force supply officer, and I ended up in the Army Quartermaster Corps. But my first 2 years was armor. So I went through the armor basic course, went to Vietnam as an armor officer. So
can you talk about that? When you graduated, you went to, where was armor school, and what was that like?
I went to Fort Knox to armor school. That was armor officer basic course. And I mean, it was good training. You know, you got training on everything from communications and armor tactics and military justice and the whole 9 yards. Then after the armor course, I got to stay on for another course about, I don't know, it was maybe 8 weeks or so. It was a maintenance course, and just randomly selected, I suppose, to stay on for this maintenance officer course, which would qualify you to be like a battalion maintenance officer. And then after that, I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division. And a little strange to have an armor officer in the 82nd Airborne Division, but they had a CAV squadron. And it was light CAV. There were no track vehicles at the time. But the CAV squadron consisted of 2 ground CAV troops, and then the third CAV troop was a aviation troop, air CAV. And so I was assigned to one of those troops, and I was a platoon leader there, and spent about 6 months at Fort Bragg before I went to Vietnam.
How long was the time period when you got to the 82nd until you picked up a platoon of your own? Did you have any staff duty time, or you?
No, I went straight in. Yeah, I walked straight into as a platoon leader job, first day on the job, basically.
What was that like?
It was okay. I mean, I felt like I was fairly well prepared. And again, the Corps cadets, you know, really gives you a lot of experience in doing that. So, I mean, it wasn't overly intimidating or whatever. Had a good platoon sergeant, which is, you know, very valuable to a young lieutenant coming in. It was okay. And I felt like that the training I got at Fort Knox, while it was mostly on tanks, it was okay for what I was doing. It was, you know, reconnaissance platoon, and I had gun jeeps and 106 anti-tank weapons and an 81 millimeter mortar all in my platoon. And part of the training at Fort Knox had included armored CAV tactics and organization. So I was okay. I mean, you know, I was like, I think any other lieutenant, you're a little bit intimidated maybe, but I recall there was a West Point lieutenant that had just come in about the same time I was. And, you know, so here was me, and here was this West Point lieutenant. And I was always kind of like, well, you know, I feel like I'm playing second fiddle here to this West Point cadet. And after about 2 months, it's like, nah, I'm as good as he is. You know, we were equals. So I think the Corps of Cadets and the training initially, it was good. It was good training.
What was the makeup of your platoon, age-wise? Were they draftees, non-draftees?
Gosh, age-wise, I mean, they were kids. I mean, they were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. They were all airborne qualified. So, of course, they had been, whether they'd been drafted or volunteers, that you still had to volunteer to go to airborne school. So they were all volunteers by the time they got to the 82nd. And most of them were good kids. You know, you always have a couple, you know, loose cannons in every group like that. But for the most part, they were good. And some of the NCOs had already been to Vietnam and returned. And so they were very valuable in terms of working with the other soldiers in the platoon and with me. So I felt like I had a good group.
And then what was that like when you found out at first that you were going to go to Vietnam?
Well, I expected it because, again, this is early 1967, and the Vietnam War was building up. So it was just kind of like, okay, I'm in the Army, I'm a lieutenant, I'm going to Vietnam. You know, want to or not, it's just a matter of when. And so, I mean, it was expected. I wasn't overwhelmed by it or anything. I kind of started doing things as much as I could to get ready to go, you know. But it was just almost like, okay, that's the next step through my 3 years as a Army officer.
Did you feel your platoon was prepared before you went over there?
The platoon I had?
Yes.
Yeah. I think I got very good training in the 82nd for going to Vietnam. I can't imagine some guys maybe coming in their first tour as some kind of a staff officer or some job that's not really working with troops, and then all of a sudden going to Vietnam and find themselves in a platoon there. That's not good. But no, I had, like I said, about 5 or 6 months with the platoon at Fort Bragg, and yeah, that probably did as good a job as you could in preparing you to go to Vietnam and take over a similar platoon there. So I was fortunate in that aspect.
Could you explain a little bit, like geographically, places where you were during your first deployment, and maybe the mission that they gave you guys, the objective, everything that you guys were told when you got there, all that? Yeah.
I was assigned to the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, and they had just recently moved up in this area right here. And this is not a very good map, I realize, but in this general area up in the northern part, this is the DMZ. So we were operating in this general area here, and I got a platoon, assigned to a platoon, and again, we had not just light vehicles, but we had armored personnel carriers, M113s, and that's an M113, which we used them as scout vehicles. An infantry squad was mounted in all of them, but I had 8 of these in my platoon. And initially, when we were around Chulai, we had really 3 missions, and they kind of rotated the platoons between the 3. And the best mission, the most fun mission, was convoy escort. And we would go down Route 1 from Chulai down into Quang Ngai, I think was about as far south as we ever went. And we would pick up convoys coming back north, fuel tankers, ammo trucks, just whatever was in the convoy, supplies, and escort them back up north to Chulai. And then some other unit would pick them up and keep them moving north from there. And that was good duty. You got away from base camp. You got out in the open. It was fairly safe at that time. I mean, it was that particular time and that particular place, things were pretty much under control. But I mean, there was always a threat, and mines were a threat. But it was escort duty for convoys moving north. That was one thing. We also acted as the reaction force for the brigade headquarters. So one platoon was always ready to move out at any time and go wherever needed within the local area. And then the 3rd platoon was always on bunker duty along the perimeter of the brigade, part of the perimeter of the brigade base camp. And you'd go up and that was you had bunkers and you had to stay alert 24 hours a day on that bunker duty. So that was not bad duty. And like I say, things were pretty peaceful at the time, and it was good duty. That lasted for about 2 months or so. And then we moved up north into Tam Key. Tam Key is on this map, but it was further up. And we took over as 101st Airborne, and some of the Marine units had moved north, so we kind of fell in and took over their location. And things were a little more primitive up there. Primitive as in there were no buildings or anything, and we lived out of our vehicles. But most of our work then was out in the field working with infantry companies or doing our own what we call search and destroy missions out to the west of the Tam Key area. And that was, it was a little hotter area, but fortunately, like I said, I had, in my platoon, I had 8 50 caliber machine guns and 16 M60 machine guns. So the Viet Cong or the NVA, they didn't necessarily want to mess with that much firepower. That was a lot of firepower. And for the most part, they left us alone. We'd go out, and if they were in the area, they were hunkered down. We got into a couple little things with sniper fire and that kind of thing, but they pretty much left us alone. And then moving into early 1967, we started picking up more and more activity. More intelligence started coming in that there were forces moving east out of the western part of South Vietnam. And we actually started seeing more and more troops in a distance, small numbers or whatever. And this was all part of the movement in towards Da Nang and Hue, leading up to Tet, was at the end of January in 1967. So, you could almost see that there was something going on, and that was that got a little scary there. So.
Could you explain a little bit about the search and destroy, what that was?
Yeah, usually. A lot of times it was just sort of a show of force. I mean, we could go out, and the thing about the Cav platoon, we were very mobile, and we were fast, even out in that open area. So we could cover a lot of ground in a pretty short period of time. Whereas an infantry company, they were walking, and it took them a long time to get from point A to point B. And we could do it in a matter of maybe an hour or 2 hours or, whatever it was. So, we could make a show of force in a pretty large area. We could be here one day, tomorrow we're over here. So it kind of kept the enemy off guard in terms of, okay, where are they going to be? Whereas an infantry unit, they're slowly moving in this direction, so it's a little more easy to predict where they're going to go. And we worked a lot with infantry units. And just a couple examples. I know one time the infantry company was being extracted by CH-47 helicopters. So rather than leave them sort of naked with the helicopters coming in, they brought us in, and we formed a perimeter and just secured the landing zone while the helicopters came in, extracted the infantry company, and then we could disperse from there. So we did that several times. Frequently we would meet up with an infantry unit at night. They would come into a night assembly area, and again, they were, they had some M60s. That was the heaviest weapons that they had. So we would rendezvous with them and spend the night in a logger position with the infantry to give them more protection. And then the next day they may go this way and we'd go that way, and the next night we might be over with another infantry company. So it provided security for the infantry. And then we did other things, if suspected sightings in an area, they may send us in to see what we could find or whatever. And again, we always had one platoon back that was the security for the brigade headquarters area. So it was a little more interesting up in that area.
What was the biggest challenge of being a platoon leader? Leadership challenge or anything that was going on that was made your job difficult?
I don't know. Looking back on it, I can think of things now that, gee, I should have done this, or I should have done this better, or whatever. But at the time, I don't know that there were any great challenges. You just wanted to keep everybody kind of focused, and I know one situation, and this sounds almost mundane or whatever, but it's important. We had one platoon that they were a little bit of a slap-happy group. I mean, just discipline in that platoon was not all that great. And they would go out and they'd get sniper fire. Nothing big, but just, sniper fire. And, you could hear on the radio, everything was going crazy, And we'd go out the next day, my platoon, in the same area, nothing. Next time they'd go out, they'd get sniper fire. We'd go out, nothing. And I asked my platoon sergeant, I said, "Why? I don't understand that. Why do they shoot at them and not us?" And he said, "I'll tell you why." He said, "Because when we go out, every man in our platoon has got on a steel helmet, got on flak jackets, and they're on the machine guns. They go out, no helmets, sometimes no shirt, no flak jacket. Just it was one of those discipline things where, if you're the bad guy, who are you going to shoot at? The guy that's not wearing a helmet and not wearing his flak jacket, or are you going to shoot at the guy that looks like he's prepared? So just keeping that edge, just keeping that discipline, just stay alert, keep an eye out for that, sending a recon guy over here, check that. Just, I guess, alertness maybe was the biggest thing that was a challenge. And then trying to make sure that the NCOs did the same thing. But most of the kids, most of the young soldiers, they were conscientious. I mean, they didn't want to be there, obviously, and but most of them, they did their job. I didn't have any real troublemakers. Some you could count on as solid as a rock. Others were, you had to keep an eye on them. But again, just I think once they got to know me and realized that I was fair and I was competent as much as a lieutenant can be, it worked out. So just keeping these soldiers kind of on, just being prepared.
Were there civilians in the area that you had interactions with, and if so, what was that like?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of interaction. A lot of that area had been cleared out. I mean, they had just moved all the Vietnamese out. We had some encounters, like when we were running convoys, you'd go through these little villages and all the kids were coming out and they wanted us to toss sea rations or whatever. And I mean, you just kind of see the day-to-day hustle and bustle in these little Vietnamese villages. But there really wasn't that much interaction. Now, we had, when I was at Chu Lai, we had some Vietnamese civilians that worked on post. For example, the camp barber, was a Vietnamese, and he basically spoke no English, and he always used a straight razor to shave you, which, you always kind of sitting there wondering, what were you doing last night at midnight? Instead of having a straight razor, do you have an AK-47 out in the bushes somewhere? But so there were a few workers there. But once we moved up north into the Tam Key area, there was very little interaction. We had we would have Vietnamese interpreters working with us. Again, you always had a little bit of concern as to really, are they totally on your side or not? I mean, we never had any reason to think they were not, but, you just need to kind of keep your eye on it.
And did that pretty much wrap up your first deployment?
Yeah, well, until I got blown up. That was kind of the abrupt end, but this happened up just west of Tam Key, and I had a mine blow up in front of me. It was we were going into a night perimeter, just like I said we did with the infantry unit sometimes. And I was actually standing up on top of my armored personnel carrier, and I was directing some of the other vehicles into a position. And all of a sudden, just this dirt came right up in front of me. I never heard anything. And next thing I knew, I was on the ground about 10 yards behind my armored personnel carrier. And as it turned out, what had happened was that the North Vietnamese, or Viet Cong, had rolled an unexploded Air Force bomb into an old foxhole and put a top on it with a pressure detonator. And some of the infantry guys stepped on it. And it was right in front of my vehicle. So it went up, because in a foxhole, most of the explosion, the shrapnel went this way. And I was high enough by standing up that I just caught a bit of that shrapnel, and this is what they took out of my neck. So that was, I don't know if you can see that very well or not, but it's a pretty hefty little object there. Mm-hmm. But I got that in the neck, and then somehow, and I think when I got blown off the top of the vehicle, I think my right foot got hung up on a gun mount or an antenna or something, and I broke a bone in my foot. So that ended my tour in Vietnam. I got medevac from there, and so that ended my tour there.
Did they send you stateside?
Yeah, because I had a broken bone.
Okay.
And normally when you had a broken bone, because you figure that's a number of weeks to heal. So I was in Vietnam for about 3 days, and then they evacuated me to Japan, and I spent about a week in Japan, and then from there just back to the U.S. But I got credit for a full tour, but so that ended my first tour.
How many months into your first tour was that?
About 5 months. Yeah.
And how long was the typical tour?
12 months.
12 months.
Yeah.
Cool, yeah.
Now, normally what they did, like a guy in the combat arms, normally if you were a platoon leader for 6 months, they would rotate you out for another job. That was very common because they figured 6 months in the field and then they'd find you became an assistant S4, an assistant S1, or, some job a little more to the rear. So I probably would have been rotated out maybe in another month anyway. Not that I wanted to, because I wanted to stay with my guys. That's one of those things that you read about in World War II, but it's very true. Once you get in with that group, they're your guys, and you don't want to leave them. So it may be a good thing for you to leave, but you don't want to leave them. So.
And then what was to follow when you came back home, and then what was your next assignment?
I was stationed at Fort Lee. By that time, almost 2 years in armor was up, so they went ahead and transferred me early to quartermaster. So I was assigned to Fort Lee, and I went through about an 8-week supply management officer course at Fort Lee, and that sort of indoctrinated me to quartermaster and logistics and material management, that sort of thing. But then as soon as I finished that, I was assigned as a company commander of an AIT company, Advanced Individual Training Company. And these were soldiers that had finished basic training, but then they had been assigned to Fort Lee for additional training. And a lot of them were parachute riggers. The parachute rigger course was at Fort Lee. And this was about a 13-week course. And we had some other people, the supply clerks, petroleum specialists, any of the quartermaster MOSs were trained at Fort Lee. So I had the company and it was basically just a sort of administrative role. They were assigned to my company for barracks, meals, military discipline, admin purposes, and then they would leave and go to class during the day, to learn to pack parachutes or whatever. And then at the end of the day, they'd come back and they were sort of mine. So I had really no role in the training of the troops, but it was just discipline and like I say, dining hall and that sort of stuff. And sometimes I would have as many as 350 soldiers in that unit, maybe going to 4 or 5 different classes and different schedules and all.
What was this transfer like from in the field armor to something more behind the lines and totally different role?
Well, it wasn't that big a transfer in a way because I was working with troops in Vietnam, and then when I came back, my first assignment at Fort Lee was with troops again. So I was working with troops, and I really wasn't doing anything in terms of quartermaster duties or supply or anything like that. My role was a company commander, so it really wasn't that much of a transition. And like I said, I went to that training course, the supply management officer course, but that you were trained, but then you sort of tucked it away and didn't use it for a while. And then at the end of a year, I was a company commander for a year, and then I went to the advanced course, the quartermaster officer basic or advanced course. And then at the end of that, I went back to Vietnam again. So.
Did you go back to Vietnam as a company commander?
No. This time I went back. The first 6 months I was with the 199th Infantry Brigade, which another was separate infantry brigade down in the sort of in the Saigon area, down in this area here around Bien Hoa and Long Binh, all this area here. And I was assigned as the assistant brigade S4. I had a major, infantry major that was the brigade S4, and then I was his assistant, and it was set up so that the S4 was a combat arms guy, and then his assistant was a supply guy. So I worked that job for 6 months, and that was pretty much a desk job. Probably more paperwork than anything else, but again, it was stuff that had to be done, and I got out some in some of the forward areas, working with some of the battalion S4s and that thing. And then this was when they were starting to pull back some of the units out of Vietnam. This was in 1970. The 199th was one of the units that was being deactivated. So you've heard about the guy that stayed back and turned out the lights when they left. I was one of those guys. As battalions would stand down, and they would have to turn in their equipment and all that kind of stuff. And I was literally one of the last guys assigned to the 199th Infantry Brigade because I was processing and out processing the equipment.
What was the biggest challenge when moving up into these more senior roles as you moved up into different positions?
I don't know. I think maybe just you realize, and there's good and bad, that you realize that you're no longer working with troops in the field, and that's good, and that you're not getting shot at, but it's bad because you're not working with these soldiers, and you're working up here. Like I say, in some cases you're pushing paper, and you just kind of got to adjust your brain that's okay. That's what somebody's got to do that, and I'm the guy to do it. But you learn a lot by doing that because you end up going to meetings or working with senior officers or whatever, and that just you start getting a better picture of what goes on up here, and sometimes you have to learn that. It's like, I've got this task and I don't know how to do it, but I got to figure it out from somebody else as to okay, and then you just learn more things, how things work, organization. Sometimes you have to learn how to work the system, whatever. So,
how did re-enlistments work? Did you know that you wanted to make a career out of it to begin with, or is it something you kind of gradually just kept on staying in? Well,
when you accept a regular Army commission back then, you had a 3-year obligation. So my 3 years came up when I was at Fort Lee, at just about the time, I guess, that I started the advanced course. And I didn't have to do anything. It's like, okay, you're in. The only way you get out is to resign. Well, starting the advanced course, if you complete the advanced course, that obligates you to another year. So it's kind of like, okay, I got to 3 years. I went to the advanced course. When I finished that, I had another year. So it was kind of like it kind of kept going. And by that time, I was, I'm probably going to stay in. The money was good because at the end of 2 years, you got automatically promoted to captain, and you got a big raise for going over 2. So from one day to the next, when you got promoted and went over 2, you got a pretty good raise, and that wasn't bad. And so it was kind of like, okay, I've got 2 years or 2 tours of Vietnam behind me already. I'm probably not going to go back. Money's good. I enjoy what I'm doing. I wasn't married at the time. It's kind of like, hey, this is okay. This is a good life. So you kind of, rather than decide to stay in, you just decide not to get out,
What was your assignment after your second tour?
I came back to the Army Engineer School at Fort Belvoir. It's now at Fort Leonard Wood, but it was at Fort Belvoir at the time. And I came back as an instructor in the Army Engineer School. So I was one of a few non-engineers on the faculty at the engineer school. But my job was teaching logistics. So you had these engineers, for the most part, going through the advanced course, engineer captains. And part of their training was learning about other branches and how the Army operated and all. And many of them had no background in logistics at all. They'd been strictly engineer duty. And so I had a block of instruction in each one of the advanced courses and in some other courses as well, teaching about how the supply system worked, how the requisition system worked, what different supply and maintenance units did, what was the difference between direct support maintenance and general support maintenance and those kind of things. And so it was just kind of a general education of these engineer officers about logistics.
Were these roles and jobs, is stuff you had the option to volunteer for and kind of guide your career where you wanted to, or was it kind of thrown at you? Like, when you say like you had this opportunity to do this, was it kind of like you had some choices, or was it like, here's where you went next, here's where you went next?
You always filled out a dream sheet, as they call it. In other words, like when I left Vietnam the second time, it's like, okay, where do you want to go? So I said, I want to go back to Fort Lee, which I thought that would be pretty easy as a quartermaster officer going back to Fort Lee. And I didn't really have any idea as to what I wanted to do. I mean, there's lots of jobs there. So it came back, and I remember the guy telling me, I couldn't get you Fort Lee, but I got you Fort Belvoir, which is close. Well, okay. Well, what am I going to do at Fort Belvoir? I'm a little bit, but once I got there weren't many quartermaster slots there, so I went into the school faculty position. The Army, gives you the opportunity to state your preference a lot of times in jobs or places. They don't always, go that way. I had other assignments later that I did have some more say in that. But you can have some control over that. And another thing that a lot of guys, and there's you see a lot of these fast burners, the guys that are really doing well, and they don't want a job for more than about a year. I'll do this job for a year, then I got to go get this job, and then I got to get this job, and then I got to get this job. And it's sort of a ticket punching thing. I got to be an assistant S3. I want to be an S2. I want to go to the brigade staff. They got this, I got to check all these things out. That's going to help me get promoted. And I guess that's good, but the problem is you only spend maybe 1 year in that job. And sometimes you can learn a whole lot in 1 year, but sometimes you can't. You're learning in that first year, and it's that second year where you start applying, and then you can really do better. And I was never that way, and I look back on it, maybe I should have been. I may have been more successful had I been that way, but I had there was a couple of jobs I had. My job in Germany, I had for 3 years. I had the same job for 3 years. And, maybe I shouldn't have had it. Maybe I should have tried to get out. But I liked it. It was a good situation. I was doing a good job. Nobody else wanted that job. And so it's like, okay, I'm your guy. And I spent 3 years doing that same job. So, there's different ways to look at it,
What did you do in Germany?
I was assigned to the U.S. Army Europe Material Management Center. And it was part of the G4 office of USARA headquarters. But the Material Management Center, we managed virtually all the equipment coming into Europe and within Europe. And we were divided up into we had a communications electronic division, we had an armament division, we had a missile division, we had an aviation division. And each one of these divisions handled a certain category of equipment. And I had, like I said, nobody else wanted my job. I had the oddball area. It was called Troop Support Systems. And I had everything from bridging equipment. I had boats in my division. I had all the power generation equipment. I had laundry, bath facilities. I had mobile field kitchen trailers, light sets, tool kits. I had all this miscellaneous stuff. And generators, for example, was a big deal, and a lot of people don't think much about power generation equipment. But you think about all the missile systems, all the air defense systems, all the communication systems, you got to have power. and it's all mobile generators. And they're different sizes, they're different characteristics or whatever, and they were a constant pain in the neck because everybody wanted more generators, or if the generators went down, problems. So we managed getting the generators from the U.S. into Europe, in the assigned places. New equipment fielding was a big part of it. In other words, a new bridging, for example. I don't know whether I think they still use the ribbon bridge. It's a piece of engineering equipment. And it was new. It was newly developed, and they were fielding it to Europe. And you had to be involved with who gets it first, what's the priority, the training of this, the repair parts, the maintenance manuals, all that stuff had to come together at the right time and the right place. So the Material Management Center managed that kind of stuff, as well as all of the reserve equipment. We had depots in Europe that had war reserve stocks. We also had what was then called POMCUS stocks, and POMCUS was pre-positioned, it was pre-positioned material in Europe for a unit coming into Europe. In other words, like in wartime, a unit from Fort Hood could get on an airplane and with individual weapons, fly to Europe, and they would fall in on a warehouse full of tanks, vehicles, trucks, radios, everything they needed to deploy. Well, all of that equipment was packaged in a warehouse somewhere, in several places in Europe. So all of that stuff had to be maintained as well. And if you got equipment in, you put it in POMCUS, well, you couldn't use that to resupply a deficiency over here because you had to keep those packages together. So you had different buckets, sort of, so to speak, war reserves, operational projects, the POMCUS stock, and then what was actually going out to the troops. So you had to constantly be juggling that, replacing equipment, running it through maintenance in many cases. So it was an interesting job, and I enjoyed it. I had good people working for me, Germans as well as U.S. Like I said, nobody else wanted the job, and I liked it. So it worked out there.
What years was that around?
That was 1977 to 1980. That was in Germany.
Okay. And what rank would you have done?
I was a major at that time. Yeah.
And was that your last assignment or no?
No. I came back. This was a case where I did get sort of what we wanted. The commanding general was a 2-star that was in Troop Support Command back in the U.S., which was part of the Army Materiel Command. He had a visit over to Europe, and we briefed him and all. And he said, I'd like to have you and you and you come back to the States at the end of your tour and work for me. And so I was one of the guys that he said, yeah, because you've got experience working with this equipment. And his job back in the States was kind of working the same equipment for the whole Army. Procurement, storage, distribution, and all. So when I made a phone call from Europe about my equipment, it went back to this command in St. Louis. So when I left Germany, I went back to that command in St. Louis doing not exactly the same thing, but sort of with the same bulk of equipment. So I spent really 4 years there, and I had 3 different jobs, but there. So I had a 7-year chunk of my career working with sort of the same group of oddball equipment, and it kind of developed an expertise in that area. And again, it would have been a lot more exciting if it had been airplanes or tanks or something like that. But it wasn't. But I felt like that I did develop this expertise, and I knew the system, so I was making a contribution for that stuff as part of my career. So.
Did you meet your spouse while you were in the Army?
Yeah, I did. When I was stationed at Fort Belvoir at the engineer school, I met my first wife, and we got married there. And then we were married for 30-some years. She passed away about 10 years ago, and then I remarried about 2 years ago. But yeah, I met her. She was in the Washington area working for the government there. So.
What was that like, having a marriage while in the Army?
It was fine. Your wife had to be agreeable to moving around, because you knew that you were going to be here for a short period of time and go somewhere else. And as long as they accepted that was okay, and she did. So we went to Germany together, and then we were at Fort Lee again the second time. We were in St. Louis again, and it was fine. But again, like I say, if the wife if she wants her career, it doesn't always work that way, because her career and your career may not be going the same direction. Or if she wants to always live near her family, her mom and dad, that may not work. But as long as they're flexible and like my wife worked most of the time that I was in the Army, but it were that jobs that were not really a career. I mean, it was more administrative work or, something like that. But the social aspect was fine. You had friends that were in the military and their wives, so you were constantly making new friends, and a lot of them we stayed in touch with for years. So,
what was your favorite duty the whole time you were in the Army, and why?
I would say probably in Germany, the 3 years I was there. I liked Germany. I mean, it was just it was a 3-year vacation in a way, and I don't mean that literally, but you could travel, weekends or whatever. So it was just a whole new area. But I had a good job. I had good people working for me. I could see progress. My first day on that job, when they just reorganized, that's one of the things that in the Army, they're always reorganizing. You either get there just after they reorganized, or they reorganize while you're there, or they're going to reorganize right after you leave. It's just one of those constant things. So when I walked in, literally about the first or second day I was in Germany, they took me in and showed me and said, okay, you're taking this branch. It's a new branch. We've just reorganized. So you're going to be getting some people from over here and some people from over here and some people from over here. These people don't necessarily know each other. They may be trained, but not in your particular area. So, it's an open, empty box. And it said, let me show you your office. So we went down the hall, opened the door to my office. There was a room with absolutely nothing in it except a telephone sitting in the middle of the floor. And it's kind of like, okay, I guess I'll start from here. And I did, and that was fun, because you got these people in, and you kind of had to figure out, what am I doing? And and I started putting it together, and then that's what I say. The first year was spent putting it together, and then I had 2 more years where it was working, and I like that. I like the people. And like I say, there were Germans. I had American civilians working for me, and I had American military working for me. So it was just a good job. And again, I felt like I was making a contribution in getting this equipment from the States to the right place in Europe. And that was interesting. I got out some to see some of the bridging exercises and that sort of thing. And it was kind of like this, this is something as a quartermaster officer, I would never see a bridging operation where they're bridging the Rhine. But I had a chance to do that. So that was probably my best assignment.
What would be your biggest regret about your military service, if there is any? For example, like an opportunity or a goal that you didn't have the chance to pursue, or maybe you didn't accomplish?
I reached my 20 years, so I could retire. And not long after I reached the 20-year mark, I got considered for a full colonel. And I was a lieutenant colonel at the time. And I don't know how familiar you are with that, but if your data rank is within a certain area, you're considered. And then they select whatever number they need. Well, I was not selected, which is not terribly unusual, because a lot of guys don't get selected. And I think the biggest reason that I did not get selected is because I never had a battalion command. And in the infantry, armor, whatever, that's a big deal, be a battalion commander. In the supply quartermaster logistics area, it's not quite as big a deal because there aren't that many slots. And what I was doing in some cases was maybe equal to a battalion command. But you figure all the guys on the promotion board, for the most part, are infantry, artillery, armor. So when they see a file come across their desk and like, this guy never commanded a battalion, I don't want him. He doesn't deserve to be promoted. So your file goes over here. So if I had a regret, I would say that it's somewhere along that line towards the last 5 years, I would have tried to get a battalion command. And with that battalion command on my record, I think I would have had a much better chance for being selected to 06, to full colonel. But having said that, I'm not sure that I really wanted to be a colonel because I would have gone back to Europe. I know right off after I got selected, I would have had a 3-year obligation. And it's kind of like, I'm not real sure I've had 22 years of this. I may be ready to go back, So it's kind of a mixed bag,
And then the contrary, what about your military service are you most proud of?
I don't know. I can go back to Vietnam, being a platoon leader in combat. That's a challenge. Anytime you're in combat with a bunch of guys and you survive and they all survive. So that was something that I was proud of. But I was also proud of, like I said, that situation in Europe where I took this group of, it's kind of like herding cats initially. You get, all these oddball people and you pull them together and you organize it from scratch. And I didn't have many people telling me how to do this because they were busy doing their own thing. And I kind of built that from scratch and into a good cohesive group. So I'm kind of proud of that. Building that team together. And we had about 25 individuals in that branch. And that was a good thing, I think.
Looking back on all of it, what would be your advice to your 21, 22-year-old self graduating from Virginia Tech commissioning? What would be your advice to yourself if you could?
I would say get that troop duty. Be a platoon leader, be a company commander. At some point, get that battalion command because I think that's very important. Probably get those different jobs. I would say probably don't spend more than 2 years in the same job because if you do, people are going to think, well, he's not trying to work his way up. He's setting it a job. So I would say, keep moving. Don't be afraid to take assignments that are maybe less glamorous than you like to think. Sometimes these mundane assignments can be to your benefit. So I would say, get the checklist assignments and don't be afraid to move. Don't get in trouble. As an officer, there's things you do and you don't do. And so do the do things and don't do the don't do things. Stay. And another thing would be to stay in contact with some of your senior people that maybe know you quite well. In other words, if you're a company commander and you've got a battalion commander and you've got a good relationship with this guy, after you leave or after he leaves, stay in touch. Because you never know where he's going to go and where he can reach back and help you. Or you can say, Colonel so-and-so, give me your advice. Tell me what you think about this assignment or whatever. So continue to maintain this, whether it's just a quick email or, just stay in touch with these guys, unless sometimes there's a personality conflict or whatever, maybe not in those. But if you've got a good rapport with your commander or whatever, then maintain that contact. And you never know, 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, you'll run across him again. And he may be in a position to say, yeah, I remember you. You're good. You're a good guy. I got a job for you.
Is there anything we didn't touch on today that you want to add?
No, not really. Like I said, I think the Virginia Tech Corps cadets did a good job in preparing me to go in the Army. I don't regret any of that at all. So it's you covered a lot of ground.
All right. I want to thank you very much for being willingness to do this. It was great sitting down talking to you. It was really interesting to hear all your stories.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay.